Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Welcome to my final Tier 6 post of 2025. This is 6 albums I've been listening to for the past month or so, and each of these albums exist at a point in time of the artist's development where their identity was questioned. And rather than give into this identity, the preconceptions of what their identities were, they used that opportunity to challenge those expectations and redefine themselves. And in doing so, reclaim their artistic integrity along the way. And we're going to start off this thread by looking at Buckingham Nicks' self-titled debut. Fleetwood Mac was 10 years in whenever the album Fleetwood Mac was released. It was hardly their debut album. And many people see that album as the band's debut. And in many ways it was, because going forward from the release of this album, when Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks joined the group after Bob Welch left, it was a massive, massive redefinition of what the group was capable of. In the same way that, in a way, whenever the Buggles joined Yes in the 80s. But Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks as a duo had been around for several years before that, developing their own kind of unique style. This particular album shows them in their mid-20s really trying to define themselves after meeting each other in high school that probably could be best described as a California folk rock. And even this early in Lindsey Buckingham's career, he'd really developed a really interesting concept of the guitar as almost as an orchestral instrument. But if you're looking for some hidden version of Rhiannon or some long lost hit, it's not quite there yet. Their songwriting is emergent, but not quite developed yet. But still, there's some fantastic moments on this album, and it's really kind of a shame that when it was released in 1973, it kind of flopped. And so they really thought it was kind of go off into nowhere. But the song Frozen Love from this album kind of caught the ear of Mick Fleetwood, and he invited Lindsey Buckingham to kind of take Bob Welch's place in Fleetwood Mac. What an amazing demo to put in front of Mick Fleetwood to show them the potential of their group. You've got the way that Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks' voice would combine in very significant ways, the way they're able to produce and stack vocals in this situation. And of course, there's an extended guitar section in the middle of it that showed where Lindsey Buckingham's vision was going. But Lindsey Buckingham wouldn't join Fleetwood Mac without Stevie Nicks involved as well, which created its own interesting dynamic, but one that really plugged itself well into Fleetwood Mac and would define them going forward. Now, unfortunately, since this album didn't do too well in the public eye, it kind of just faded off and was never even reprinted, which has created a bit of mythic scarcity for the album. Until 2025, just last year, it got a reissue. So although this wasn't a huge hit, it was kind of a fragile beginning that quietly helped to redefine Fleetwood Mac and turn them into a powerhouse group moving forward all throughout the 70s and early 80s.
And if you go forward, I'll meet you there. And if you climb up through the cold, freezing air, look down below you, search out above, cry out for frozen love,
Okay, next up I got Pom Poko's Champion. Pom Poko released an album a couple years ago that I really got into called Cheater, and they have a very interesting mix of math rock and post-punk and infectious pop melodies that kind of all coexist with each other. A good way to think of them is the kind of playful energy of the Cardigans with the kind of aggressive experimentalism of Deerhoof. And it was surprising me to find out this band is Norwegian because, the assumption, especially given the name based on a Studio Ghibli film, that they have a real connection to sort of Japanese rock music. Especially the vocalist pushes her voice up into the sort of cutissimo style that you hear in a lot of Japanese rock. But Norwegian they are, and they have a very exciting sound that is also very accessible. And I think that's even more the case on Champion than it was in their previous albums, because there's less kind of chaos and less aggression and a little bit more attention to playfulness and singability. Now, those things still coexist. There is still a lot of aggression and angularity in this album. It still earns its post-punk label, and it still has a real raw liveness, I think, that betrays their reputation as a killer live band with a lot of great chemistry. But it feels a little bit more mature. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're giving up play. It's just sharpening it into something a little bit more focused. Next, I got De La Soul. De La Soul is dead. Here you see De La Soul kind of destroying their own myth before it had a chance to define them. And I say that because this album was released in 1992, which is really like the golden time for hip-hop. By the time you get to the 90s, you're starting to see definite styles of hip-hop start to emerge. And one of De La Soul's points was to try to, especially on their debut album, to focus on more positive sides of things. Because, you know, as gangster rap was coming out, there's a lot of negativity that was associated with rap music that was giving it a lot of visibility, but also was kind of giving it a bad reputation. So De La Soul was one of many groups at the time was trying to put a more positive spin on it. But that positivity that they put out in their first album was starting to work against them. They were sort of getting stereotyped as kind of like hippies, and that really wasn't their point at all. So the clever thing about De La Soul is Dead was that it does have these little skits that you start to see in albums in the early 90s for hip hop. And in the case of this album, the skits are sort of this ongoing story about this group of bullies that find a De La Soul album and are listening to it and commenting as they go through. So it gives De La Soul an opportunity to make music that is inherently theirs in their style, but also comment on it in a way that kind of, you know, acknowledges the negative attitudes that have been placed on them for being the kind of music that they were, that was in some ways counter to what was more popular than hip hop at the time. Now, like many other early 90s hip hop albums, this album is musically very dense as far as sampling goes. You probably couldn't get away with it, at least not financially today, because the amount that you probably have to pay out to all these different samples to make these layers would be, you know, too expensive. But like a lot of other albums from that era, the density of sampling allowed the individual samples to not be heard, but to the music to transcend the use of that kind of collage approach to creating music. And initially the album was pretty divisive. It was seen as a little bit kind of scattered. And in some ways, I think the skits in this album, there's a justifiable criticism that you could say that they got a little bit distracting. They kind of took over at a certain point and became more the focus than the actual hip hop. But now in hindsight, this album is really seen as a very courageous reinvention of what De La Soul was setting out to do from their first album. So in some ways, you could see the album De La Soul is Dead as a self-destructive act that actually preserved De La Soul moving forward.
Spinning and winning, no hack and sack, let me in. Spill on the bottom away, but it's okay. It's a Saturday.
Now let's all get baked like Anita.
Watch Mr. Lawn, don't look at the Peter.
Feel on the farm, I'll feel on the.
Hey, watch that.
It's a Saturday.
Now is the time to act the fool tonight. Forget about your worries and you will be alright. It's Saturday, 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 it's Saturday.
Next, I got Joe, the Crux. Now let's get this part out of the way. Joe is the stage name for Joseph Keery, who plays Steve Harrington on Stranger Things. He's an actor by trade. And very often whenever you see, you know, actors making albums, there's sort of a connotation that maybe, you know, they're better actors than than musicians, and maybe their musical output might not be as refined as one would think. But that's really, I don't think, the case at all with this Joe project. The Crux is his third album, and it really shows him displaying a very confident voice. And one of the things I'll say about the Crux in general, it's got a very rich stylistic diversity. The songs are very melodically strong and very, very well arranged. There's a harmonic vocabulary on this album that really transcends just power chords, and it betrays a little bit more musical depth, I think, than you would expect. And you could also argue, to a degree, that, you know, Joe wears his influences on his sleeve. There's a song in here that sounds like it could be a Steely Dan song. There's a song in here that sounds like it could be a Police song. There's a song in here that sounds like it could be a Car song. And there's hints on the album that these influences are intentional. It's an intentional kind of like homage to these artists. Because, for example, you have a song in here called Charlie's Garden. And if you listen to it, it has that very distinctive kind of oompa pseudo-polka feel to it that you'll hear in something like the Beatles' Octopus's Garden. Right? There's another track on there called Golden Line, which has some harmonic similarities to the parts of Abbey Road that sort of surround Golden Slumbers. So I don't really see these things as like direct, like plagiaristic or even appropriations. I kind of see them as like little musical nod and a wink. And so if you're like a music nerd like me, it almost becomes like a, you know, name that tune in some ways on the album, but never to the point where it's actually a quotation. It's always reinterpreted, but if you understand where the influences that he's pulling from in general, I think you can kind of gain a certain amount of respect for the way that he's paying tribute to his influences. And although through this description you might think that these influences may make the album feel a little bit scattered, but it's really held together by great melodies and a lot of sincerity.
That song, it's killing
Okay, next up I got TRON Ares OST by Nine Inch Nails. It almost feels like, this is destiny for Nine Inch Nails to end up doing this soundtrack. Of course, all the TRON soundtracks from the very first one were created by very innovative electronic artists. Wendy Carlos made the first TRON movie. Daft Punk was very well known for that second TRON movie. And so it just makes sense that a guy like Nine Inch Nails, who has a legacy of fantastic, innovative electronic music, could take it over. And especially, again, since, Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor have not only maintained this Nine Inch Nails identity over the last several decades, but have also been very successful as soundtrack artists in their own right. And I think it's really interesting and smart marketing for them to use the Nine Inch Nails identity and associate it with this. Of course, on the one hand, it's going to sell albums, right? But on the other hand, it kind of constrains the sounds that they would use. In a normal soundtrack, the identity of the person writing the soundtrack should be kind of removed a little bit from the final product. But as soon as you slap the name Nine Inch Nails on it, it's going to have certain associations. And I think those associations enrich the soundtrack in this case. And one of the things I think is actually an improvement on this one from previous TRON soundtracks is, like, for example, the Daft Punk soundtrack was a fantastic soundtrack for TRON Legacy. But I was always a little bit disappointed that it wasn't more electronic. It was very orchestral with some electronic stuff mixed in, and Wendy Carlos kind of did this to a degree. This album is 100% electronic, almost no orchestra in it, 100% synthesizers and synthesis straight from the brain and hands of Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor. And for me, the mark of a great soundtrack is one that can stand alone as its own listening experience. And I think that this is another place where the TRON Ares soundtrack succeeds fantastically well, because it can be listened to as a Nine Inch Nails album. There are 4 vocal tracks in the album that are spread out within it, and they are clearly Nine Inch Nails. So then you also have the cues in there, 1.5, 2-minute instrumental cues that also flow together very well, and they're spaced out through the entire thing. So once you kind of feel like you're in soundtrack land, there's a Nine Inch Nails song, and soundtracks, and then Nine Inch Nails has a really great pacing and continuity through it throughout the whole thing, so it never feels like it wears out. And the way that he kind of hid a Nine Inch Nails EP within the soundtrack makes it just, a very listenable experience. And of course, say what you want to about the TRON Ares movie. I personally loved it, but at the very least, you could say that it is a fantastic long-form video for the new Nine Inch Nails album.
Give me something to believe in. All these hands have got a hold on me. Give me something to believe in. As alive as you need me to be. Always gonna go this way.
And finally, I got Cardiac's LSD. This album was completed as an act of sheer will and love for Tim Smith. Tim Smith was the lead singer and kind of primary figure for the band Cardiacs. Cardiacs is a band that has a pretty long and interesting history, but have always kind of been on the fringes because they don't fit into any one genre very well. They're generally welcomed within the progressive rock community, but they don't really sound like the traditional idea of progressive rock. Some people would say that they're one of the few bands that were actually able to cross punk rock and progressive rock in a really compelling way. But they've always been kind of a tricky listen that sat in between those two main genres. And so they've remained a cult band for the majority of their career. Now in 2008, Tim Smith, in the midst of making this album, had an accident which caused him to have cardiac arrest, a heart attack. And he had a stroke thereafter and dealt with this kind of paralysis on part of his body and was robbed of his ability to speak after 2008. And so this album, which was pretty far along as far as its creation was concerned at the time, kind of got put on hold as he continually tried to rehabilitate himself. And he was also a person who was pretty good about writing things out. The Cardiac's music is intensely complicated. They have the wild-eyed theatricality of Oingo Boingo at their height, but also like the compositional complexity of Frank Zappa. And it's that compositional complexity that allowed them to continue to make progress on this album, despite the fact that Tim Smith was incapacitated, because he actually wrote things out and he used notes and used notation to get things out. So he was able to communicate a lot of ideas just through notation. And in just recent years, he finally had passed away with the album really not being entirely finished. There were parts of it that were left unfinished. So his brother Jim, and again, many other people who were part of the Cardiac's legacy, came in and kind of finished out the album in a way that was very deferential to Tim Smith's original vision for the group. And it's a double album that requires a whole bunch of investment of listening. If there's one way that I could describe how to experience the Cardiac's music, it almost feels like every chord progression is a new change. It's like a harmonic shift. It's like a modulation. It almost feels like Devo trying to play giant steps. So it's not necessarily a listen that you can just sit down and get all in one passing. You've got to get your ear used to listening to Cardiac's music. But once you do, there's so much brilliance that goes on with it, and there's so much depth to it that it's one of those things that just kind of keeps on giving. It's beyond imitation. And many fans of Cardiac's who listen to this album speak very highly of it in terms of how it fits within Cardiac's overall catalog. And if you're going to have an album that finishes out Cardiac's a discography, this is a fantastic one to check out.
Pull it off again, turn it down, turn around, bring it in, bring it out, pull it on again, spin it in, turn it down, cut it up, chuck it down, fuck it up again, make it jump, suck it up, cut it down. I sit down, bug, well scared, babe,
And that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe and share it out with your friends. Also, follow me over on Spotify. I've got all these tracks going up in a major list. It's going to max out at the end of the year, so please go over and check that out. And if you want to be involved in picking out the best albums of the year out of these albums, please sign up on my Patreon below. And until I see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.